Hi, welcome everybody to Strengthening Your Fundraising 5 Essentials, as I see them as the nonprofit coach. We've got some great people here and we're going to jump in. So, I am, some of you know me as a personal fundraising coach through Network for Good. I am also the CEO and lead coach of the Nonprofit Coach. My mission is to create a fairer, more equitable, and inclusive world filled with empathy and beauty. And my team and I do this by supporting nonprofits with strategic planning, fundraising training, and other types of support. So if those things are of interest to you, please feel free to reach out. I wanted to start with this slide here, where we can look about Americans giving in 2018. So this is almost dated. I think the latest report from last year is coming out. If you can imagine, we get a year of data, we process it, and then it comes out about midway through the next year. So just to give a sense of where things are, what I want people to really get from this is not maybe the details of these numbers or percentages, but more to understand that one, there are a variety of sources of income, as you can see, whether they're from foundations or corporations. But I also want you to see that the majority of the giving, that 68%, is from individuals, 9% is from bequests, so that's also from individuals, and that you can also see individual giving went down a little bit. It had gone up in 2016 around the election, and I think people kind of took a little breather. I think what I understand from last year is it started to go back up again, and who knows what's happening right now. Month by month, week by week, it's changing. But just for one thing to understand as well, as someone who's now fundraising through my third recession, is that individuals are not only the largest source of dollars, they are also the most loyal giving. They tend to stick with you through a recession if they are your loyal donors. I've had some wonderful experiences as a fundraiser of people literally taping quarters onto a piece of paper and sending them in and say, this is what I've got to give. You're really important to us, or to me and my family, whatever. I've also, during 2008, 2009, I was working in an arts organization. We would get beautiful letters with people sending in checks saying, you're the one thing I'm still giving to. We've had to cut back, but we really care about you. And so the thing I most want to emphasize here is just that there are a variety of ways of getting money, and that individuals are a very important part of that. So I'm going to stop for a second and say, does anyone have any questions or comments about that? Natalie's asked a question on the chat of whether individual giving reduced because of the tax law changes. That's a really great question. I think we do know that the tax law has affected major donor giving. The truth is the majority of people do not itemize their taxes. And so even though we use this end of year as a framework, and that gives their tax deductible, it's part of the language we use for pitching. I would say one of the biggest reasons that people give at the end of the year is actually more habit, and that we have a cultural conversation around generosity and giving between Thanksgiving and religious holidays at the end of the year. So, but what we've known for people who are major donors is that because they don't get as much off from their taxes, is that sometimes they're doing things like bundling 3 years of giving into 1 year so that they can get the tax deduction for that. And then that means there's going to be 2 years that are a little bit fallow. So yeah, it could definitely play a part in that story. Great question, Natalie. Anyone else around that? Okay. Let's see, I've got one more chat question, so I'm going to look here. Oh, thanks, Natalie. You can unmute and jump in. Don't worry. So I've talked about here 5 essentials. Now, I could have gone through and said, okay, there's 5 different giving areas, and here's the things you need to know. I think many of us who are in this sector, we know some of the day-to-day work of fundraising. But what I wanted to cover in today's webinar were the things that have a big impact on fundraising that we're not necessarily thinking about. And one of these is mindset. So one of the things I really want to caution when I talk about mindset is I'm a pretty logical person. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I think that we can believe our way into donations. I really don't think that, but I know that we can disbelieve our way out of donations. And the way to look at that is that if we have limiting thoughts, they are going to limit our actions. And when we limit our actions, then we're going to get results that correlate with that. Um, so that's the thing that I really want to make people aware of. So we talked about belief here, and a lot of where I see beliefs coming into play when we're talking about fundraising is how it intersects with identity. So if you hear yourself or someone else saying something like, I'm not that kind of person, or fear of judgment, what will they think of me? Those kind of things, those are, I think, a flag to start looking at what are the thoughts there and what kind of behaviors go with that. In this sector, over many years, I've heard people say things like, oh, I don't want to be begging. You know, that's such a negative word. The way I look at fundraising is there are people in the world who want to do good things, but those people have full-time jobs, kids, houses, all kinds of things going on in their lives, and they don't have time to spend all of their time saving animals or people or feeding people or whatever their cause is. But they would like to see those things happen. And then there's those of us who are, this is the profession we've taken on. So we're doing this. And I see fundraising really as matchmaking. A good example for me on this is that I've worked at women's organizations. Not everybody cares about women's issues. That's fine. I just want to find the people who do. There are people, if their thing, you know, like Natalie here is with Rescued Pets Movement. If they want to go save animals, go save animals. So to me, I really see it as helping people express their own values through their giving, and that's one of the ways that I see this really work out. The way I look at it too is, if I'm a donor, do I want to buy a really fancy pair of shoes, or do I want to see the world get a little bit better? I think I like to see the world get a little bit better. So, you know, it's just a simple trade-off. It doesn't have to have a negative. An example I like to use, and Roy's actually heard a lot of this, is that I have a client that I've been working with for 3.5 years. And when I started working with them, they had been around for 20 years and they had no paid administrative staff. So they had people doing their programming work. But I noticed early on there were a lot of limiting beliefs. They had a board that didn't work as well as they wanted it to. Their dollars weren't coming in the way that they wanted it to. But what I also heard were they wanted different results, but I didn't see that they saw for themselves a way to get them, or that if they were to change any types of behaviors, that new results would show up for them. And so right away you can kind of see, if you don't believe that doing something differently will get you different results, why do it, right? I wouldn't waste my time on that. Um, but what started to become clear to me is something that I see a lot in the sector and that I've had to wrestle with myself, is coming from a religious background. I've been taught a lot about sacrifice and not being selfish. It's part of what brought me into this sector, and I think that's true for a lot of people. But where it comes into conflict around fundraising is if doing something will suddenly make your organization wildly successful and you have all the money you need, um, all of a sudden you're not that sacrificing, martyred person anymore, and it starts to have a conflict with your identity. And sometimes you can see people, they're getting there right before they're going to hit that moment where that will happen. They'll suddenly pull back. They've got to re-edit it one more time, and that's the kind of thing that will hold them back. So with this particular client, I was able, over a period of months and, you know, over a year, to help them to see that actually their desire to get away from being selfish, that their investment in lack of selfishness was actually impoverishing their organization. They weren't willing to ask enough of their board. They weren't willing to ask enough of their donors. They weren't willing to ask enough of each other. And they wanted to be very nice about all of it. But it was keeping them very poor as an organization. They now, I'm happy to say, have their executive director is now paid. Their board is active, working together as a team. They're beginning to look at the pay scale for their program staff so they can have less turnover. They're having higher ticket events when we could still have events. And they're really doing a fantastic job. And a lot of it I see is coming around this core around mindset. So it was a lot I just kind of spewed at you. So I'm going to stop there and just ask if people have questions or things they want to share about their experiences around mindset. Natalie, I saw you unmute.
I was just thinking of something you had said, and it reminded me of, you don't get it if you don't ask for it. Kind of one of those where, you can think of it as begging, and you can feel uncomfortable about it, but it never hurts to ask. Like the kid in the candy store,
Yeah.
candy, and you just have to ask your mom if you can have some candy. And so, simplified analogy, but that's what I was thinking about. It's a matter of putting yourself out of that space that you're going to be told no, and putting yourself in the space that they could possibly say yes.
It's such a great point. And also, what does it mean if they say no? It means they said no, right? I think for a lot of us, all of a sudden they've rejected me. I wasn't good enough. All this stuff kind of comes up, but it just means that they said no. We don't often always know why someone said no. And our mantra in fundraising is no doesn't mean no. It means not yet. It means not at this time. It just means, keep up your relationship with those people. That's the other thing. We don't want to let go of people just because they said no. If we still care about people and we still care about communicating about our work, we don't have to drop people because they've suddenly decided they don't want to support the organization financially. All right, Jeffrey has a point in the comment here. He says, fundraising, put another way, aligning means, as in funds, with motivation, impact, and meaning, results. So thank you for sharing that, Jeffrey. I'm going to move on to the next slide here. So Natalie is actually on the board of directors for her organization. Ellen, are you on the board of directors for your organization?
Yes, I am.
Yes. All right, great. So we've got 2 board members here on today's webinar. I actually want to ask you before I go into anything, if there's something you can share, if you think a lot of nonprofit staff might be listening to this in the future, what do you want them to know about how to work with board members? What's been your experience that would what would make your board experience better in the future if other people knew this about being a board member?
I would add that I think a lot of folks think of the board as this oversight position, as opposed to being resources to help with complicated situations. We all come to the board with different professional and personal experiences, and the fact that staff could sometimes leverage that to help with something going on. Professionally for sure within the organization, but personally, we're volunteers, and so there's ways we can help outside of just this, umbrella over the organization.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point, Natalie. How about you, Ellen?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's listed in your bullet points very strongly. And I would add that I think it's really important to respect that most board members have full-time jobs that are large and can be overwhelming in and of themselves, as much as people want to contribute to the organization in which they're serving on the board. So I would encourage that in addition to whatever group meetings that you have, that there is an effort to connect with board members individually and pick their brains and use their expertise, or ask them to make a connection for you with a friend or with someone in their network. And that a lot of those asks can be accomplished with one-on-one emails and phone calls, and those should be leveraged, to a large extent.
I think that is an excellent, excellent point. We're going to talk about relationships going forward, but I think the first set of relationships to really look at are your board. And I think you've done a good job, both of you, of helping staff members see what is the potential in a board. I think that as a staff member, knowing that this person has oversight on a board, we often walk into any interaction with board members with the hat on of trying to look good. And I think that can sometimes get in the way of asking for the help that's needed. I think it happens less with smaller organizations where we kind of all we all know we don't have everything we need, and we know we need a lot of help. I think the larger the organization gets, the more interaction with the board becomes a little bit of a performance, in my opinion. Getting to this first bullet point of using the ones that work, sometimes on the staff side, I'll hear people say, oh, well, my board doesn't do this and my board doesn't do that. I got some great advice early on from Tom Wick, who is a mentor to a lot of fundraisers here in Chicago. And he really gave the advice of like, use the ones that work. So it's like if those 5 people aren't doing something, but these 5 are, then have more calls with those 5 that are, and you can work on whatever's going on with the people who are less engaged and figure out what those problems are. But rather than focusing on that, let's focus on what is working and use it to move forward. So I thought that was a really great point. One of the things that I see helping board members to increase their power and engagement is to have a lot of the asks and the communication come from other board members. So when it's coming from us as staff members, we're paid to have those interactions, and so there's a little bit, I think, a just like touch of cynicism, I think, that can creep into it. And with board members can say to other board members like, I've invited 20 of my friends, I hope you guys do too, or I've just bought a table, is everyone with me on this? That really feels really different than when the staff's like, okay, you need to do your thing now. It's like a parent or a teacher nagging. And I'm a big nagger, but I know that it's not very effective. um, One of the things I've developed a training for, it's really for board or staff, but I use it a lot with board members. And it's really talking about there's all different ways to fundraise. I just want to be super clear about that, because when sometimes people say things like, oh, I'm not a fundraiser, or I couldn't do that. And I think they're usually thinking a particular type of fundraising, something more like, sitting across the table and closing that $1 million deal. That can feel terrifying for some people. But what I like to say is like, use people's personalities and skills in a way that works for them. So, one of the best board members I have known was an organization I worked with like a year ago. And he'd say, I don't have any friends. I have 2 friends, I have a check, and I have a business. All right, we're going to work from there. I'd be like, okay. And that's what he did, and that's what he had. And somebody else is that person who's got 400 friends they're going to be bringing to the event, and maybe they don't have that business that's going to write that big check. And so letting people do what works for them, yes, we want to set expectations, but we also want to say, what is the value that this person's bringing, and how do I help them feel successful on this board experience? Um, Also, we've talked about setting expectations. When I see from an organizational standpoint people having issues with their board, I can often trace it back to the recruitment period. So I would say as nonprofits, we're often very desperate to have people on our board. We know we need a certain number. We know that for every board member we have, they're going to introduce us to more people. And that desperation will often cause us to overlook making sure somebody is a good fit, making sure that they're actually aligned with what you say the board is supposed to do. I have sat in and I have been guilty of being in those conversations where you recruit a board member and they'll say, well, I'll do all these things, but I don't fundraise. And then on the nonprofit side, we say, okay, that's fine. And then 2 meetings later, we're like, I can't believe that person doesn't fundraise. Why can't you believe it? They told it to you in the recruitment meeting. At that point, you can just say to them, well, this is a fundraising board. Why don't we look at these other opportunities for you to be involved and to share your wonderful skills? And I think that's a perfect conversation. But I think as we dilute those expectations, then we start to have a less and less functioning board, and then we're surprised. And I just want to say, don't be surprised. We created it. um, and just really also to have straightforward, non-judgmental conversations. I think you can have what could be the most awkward conversation in the world in a way that really works for everybody at the table if you're not coming in with judgment. So if you're coming in with just, hey, I've noticed that you haven't been able to make any of the last board meetings. What's going on? Is everything okay? Oh, you find out they're busy at work, or maybe you already know, maybe you're like, I know you guys just had a baby, and you haven't been able to come to the last few meetings. How are things going? Do you feel like you need some time away from the board so you can deal with those life changes? Or do you want to come back in a little bit? Or is this just not a good time anymore? I think if you're coming from a place where you are not judging them, there's no reason to hold back the communication. And I found I've spent a lifetime holding back my communication, and I found that the source of that is really that I was judging people, but I didn't want to look like I was judging people. It's very important that I'm perceived as being nice, even if I was not actually nice. Ellen shared that there's a great book related to mindset called The Soul of Money. I have to read that because that is really, I think, at the heart of what we're doing here. And finally, as we're talking about setting expectations and having non-judgmental conversations, if a board member isn't meeting the expectations, let's set them free. You know, again, if we're coming in where we're judgmental, we don't want to say that they haven't done anything. They're feeling guilty. They don't want to say anything. But maybe they actually need that time back to go deal with whatever there is in their life. And that will allow you to have a smaller, more effective board that's going to do what it says. And that's all. You know, we can put them on a committee if they need. We don't have to hate them. We don't have to let go of them forever. We just have to give them their time back, and we need to get our energy back of not chasing after people who are not ready to do what there is to do. And that's fine. And the other thing I want to say, and I think this is so overlooked in board meetings, is inspire your board members. They're here for a reason. They are here to invest in your mission. They're here because they're passionate. Some people, you know, maybe you brought them on because they're an accountant or they're a lawyer and they have a set of skills that helps your organization. You can still use that. But maybe, you know, if you're an arts organization, maybe they're there because they want to try their hand at doing something on stage, or they want to paint the stage, or they want to do some lights, or, you know, maybe they want to travel with your health organization to the site where their refugees are, or whatever. And we really need to make sure that we're giving people those kind of opportunities, and we're talking to them about why they're on the board and what they're hoping to get out of it. I think that makes a big difference. People are not going to be disengaged if they're getting what they need out of that board experience. All right, I'm going to stop there and just ask if anyone has things they want to share or say or ask. I see something from Jeffrey in the chat that he says boards need to change as organizations change. That's so true. You may have a very different board when you start out versus when you're fully established versus when you need to pivot. I think that's really true. And I think right now lots of organizations are pivoting as month by month as we get new information. And it's true that our boards may need to do that as well. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Oh, it doesn't want to. I'll have to click it. Okay, relationships and communication. So the first group we talked about, this is one of our 5 essentials, is relationships and communication. We were just talking about a set of relationships, which are board relationships. I keep using this quote from Kimberly O'Donnell. She is with Network for Good, who I also work with. And early on in the pandemic, she said this, and it just really stuck with me, that there's not a lot we can control right now, but we can control our donor relationships. And control in this case really just meaning like we can invest in them, we can reach out to them, we can talk to them. And so that's something that we're really encouraging people to do a lot of right now. And oh, Roy says Soul of Money is one of my favorite books. That's so great. I love when you guys support each other. So a couple things, you know, to just say is like call your donors and ask how they're doing. I find that when I ask people to move beyond electronic communication, sometimes they get nervous. They're like, oh my gosh. And I think there are some potential pitfalls, right? You're speaking extemporaneously. It's not pre-prepared, or you can do some pre-preparation so that you can be prepared. But you're still going to have to respond in that moment to that person. You don't know what they're going to say. They might have a criticism. You can feel like you're bothering them. But one of the ways to make those calls not awkward is to actually care how people are doing. I know it's obvious, but I emphasize it all the time with people. It's like when we get out of our own heads and we just actually care. Like right now, there's a lot going on. We don't know what's going on with people's health. We don't know what's going on with their finances. It might be at the end of that conversation you find out that person will probably never be able to give it to us because they've lost their business. It doesn't mean I'm going to stop talking to them. It means that I should send them a card. It means that I need to continue to invest and have conversations with them. And so we're not bothering people when we care about people. And right now, a lot of people feel disconnected, or they feel that I've got this two-dimensional wall between me and everybody that I care about. And so the more we can reach through that wall and connect with people, the more successful that we can be. Uh, Natalie has said that she's hired a PR person for the first time to help with donor communications, Network for Good, and social media, and she is worth every penny. That's so great to hear. And maybe Natalie, if she's that great, why don't you put her information in the chat so other people can see that and maybe add her to their vendor list. So, call your donors, we've talked about. Trust. So going into this pandemic, trust has been down. Trust is down in government. Trust is down in business. Usually when that happens, trust goes up in the nonprofit sector. That is not going on right now. I really put a lot of that into our media landscape right now, and that the way that there's so much contradictory information that people don't know who to trust and what messages are true. One of the ways that we can remedy that lack of trust is to increase our communication. At Network for Good, we're really saying to keep up this increased communication schedule that some of us started up at the beginning of the pandemic and keep it going through the year. We know that from the last recession, a lot of organizations went hands off with their donors. They're like, oh my gosh, they might be losing their house, they might be losing their job. We cannot be bothering them about our arts organization or our orphans in Haiti. They just need to do what they need to do. And what we have found out, because we've completed that recession, is that donors felt abandoned. Donors felt that nobody cared about them, that we only reached out to them when we wanted money. And so we know that that was not an effective strategy. And we know that the organizations that kept up their communication actually did well. Many of them actually increased their donor base even while their average gift went down, meaning that they were either able to maintain or grow their income during that time. And we know that this year, giving is actually up. It's been up and up and up and up. It's been at sometimes 50 to 90% higher than the same time last year. So, but you have to be out there having communication in order for that to happen. The other thing is that donors are sometimes treated like ATMs. Donor retention. So our sector only keeps 40% of their donors from year to year. This is a big problem. It's something that actually I, as an individual and as part of my organization, have been trying to think through what are the solutions. I keep thinking that part of it is actually there's like a whole fundamental setup in the way that we're approaching fundraising and communication that's leading to that to happen. We often don't recognize that we're losing 60% of our donors because we're getting in a whole bunch of new donors. And so we just think like, oh, it's fine, we stayed the same or we grew. But for every 10% that we keep, it is far less expensive to keep a donor than to acquire a new donor. And I think this often is about relationships, that we can't treat them like ATMs. We can't just ask and ask and ask without any other types of communication.
I think that's a great point, Elizabeth. I think if you treat donors like they're banks, you basically uh, turn the relationship into a transactional one. The reason they
Absolutely.
came there as a donor is because they had an intrinsic desire to make a difference. And if you can relate to that using communications, PR, and just one-on-one discussions with your donors, and to make sure that you preserve the intrinsic value, whatever that can be measured in, I think you'll be able to retain them much easier.
Absolutely. I think that's such a great point, Jeffrey. Natalie has shared in the chat that her consultant that she's been working with is Marie Elgamal, if I'm saying that correctly, and she's got the contact information in here. So that's great for everybody who's part of this. You can look up Marie. And Natalie has also shared that they've learned that they need to communicate in good times and bad, but more so during bad times to remain top of mind. I think that's really true. And the reason I'd even use the example of orphans in Haiti is someone had shared that their organization had said, does anybody even care about our orphans in Haiti? And the answer is yes, they do. Your donors still care, even while they also care about global health or the economy or whatever is going on in the news right now. I love this topic. Tracking data and analytics. So before I just go into a whole bunch here, I just want to stop and say, to kind of go around and ask people, what do you feel like you're tracking right now? Do you feel like it's adequate? Do you feel like it's giving you the information that you need to know if you're being effective, whether it's in fundraising or a different area of your organization?
I'll throw in that my concern has been kind of just around the thank you note writing process and how we make that more personal. We've looked into some of the Network for Good videos where they're just one-off videos that can really, I think, is a unique way to say a personal thank you, especially during this time. I just don't know that we're thanking everyone enough, right? So that's one thing that comes to mind as far as what concerns me about, are we doing that well enough?
That's a great question. So I think one thing we could talk about here is how would we figure out what is enough? Fundraising is both an art and a science, but I think too often organizations are using gut instinct. I've been in organizations where people will tell me like, this is what works, or this is the only way to do it, and I've got studies and all kinds of facts that say that the opposite is true. And I've also been in organizations where I know what quote unquote like the best practices are, and I've done a test and found for whatever reason at this organization doesn't hold true. The donors here, they operate in a different way, and that's fine. Actually, one of those tests saved me a lot of money and time because I was like, oh, I'm going to stop doing this thing that has no impact and takes me time and money. So I'd love for us in this conversation and all of us to jump in, like, how could we design a test to figure out if Natalie is thanking her donors enough? Who wants to jump in? Any other questions or anyone want to add to answering Natalie's question?
Well, I can add a little bit of color to that maybe. I think it's important to add, to say thank you. And for specific gifts and whatnot, obviously that's really important. I think it's also important to do the periodic communications when, just to let people know, for example, here's what's going on in the organization. Here are some of the challenges that we're facing. Here's what we're trying to do. And then say, look, have you got any thoughts or ideas that might be helpful in this situation? Now, we don't have to go for them for like an idea bank, but sometimes just having that conversation, keeping an open line of communication, being honest and, and that opens up the door to being trustworthy. Plus, you engage them in the process a little bit more and ask them for their thoughts and ideas. And if you implement them, I mean, that's worth gold.
I think that's a great point, Jeffrey. I think when I was coming up through this sector and, early on, there was a huge emphasis on quantitative data as being like kind of the only real source of data. And over the years, what I've seen is an orientation also towards qualitative data, and that there are ways of finding themes, quantifying that. There are software programs too where you can analyze if certain words are coming up over and over again. And this is why tracking is so important. Like if every call you're having goes in the database, if you yourself are actually calling donors and asking them, you'll start to see themes. It doesn't necessarily have to be a complex technological solution. But surveys are part of that too, where you can start to aggregate that information across donors. I was wondering, Ellen, Natalie, were you about to say something?
No, I just wanted to thank Jeffrey for his feedback. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Natalie. The other thing, what I would say for you, Natalie, when you're trying to figure out if we're thanking people enough, one of the things, there's that tension in there of um, what is required. So there's like a bare minimum that's required by law. There is a minimum that's required by custom. And then there's also like what is effective, what reaches that donor, what's going to have them keep giving. And you also have to balance that against your staff time, right? And so knowing where are you applying that time. Now, as fundraisers, we often have this in some type of pyramid where we're increasing our time and attention with donors the higher up the fundraising amount is, because we know that we can't lose that $1,000 or $10,000 gift. But I think there are some other things that we can do that are a little bit more democratic. And I'll give an example. I worked in an organization where I put half our donors in one group and half in another. And everybody in one group, when they made a donation, they would get a thank you call if they gave $100 or more. And the other group, I didn't. And what I was expecting was that we were going to get this like really great result. What I found out is we just lost less of the people that I called versus the people that we didn't call, we lost more of. So it definitely had an impact. I was hoping to see some skyrocketing number where we just like never lost anybody. But so obviously there were some more things we could do if we wanted to, if we said donor retention's our number one metric that we want to double down on, we're going to need in that case to emphasize more of the thanking procedures. Maybe that's where we think that we're weakest. We're going to test some things out. So, but adding a phone call on top of the other communications we were sending had an impact. So yeah, just a couple of things we've talked about. Donor retention, average gift is important. This can help you orient what ask level you're at. It can help you actually make really great predictions. If you're going to do a mailing and you know your average gift already, you can start to predict, well, if I know that industry standard is to have a 6% response rate on renewals. If I know that my average gift is $25 or $100 or whatever it is, then I'm going to predict that I can make this much. Then you can say, well, what can I do to change those numbers? I think we never want to look, one thing about analytics is like looking in the rearview mirror to tell what's going to happen in the future. I like to think of them as levers on a machine. So what can I push up or down to create different numbers and different results? And so sometimes like that's the thing that I need to be able to figure out. The other thing I just want to say is it's a lot easier to go to your boss or your other board members when you have data behind it. When someone has come to me and they've said, actually, you need to stop doing this, you need to go do this other thing. And I'm like, here's 5 studies that say otherwise. I don't need to be mad. I don't need to, be frustrated that someone's telling me what to do. I can simply just give them information and they can make choices. And so that's something too, I think that can kind of take the emotion out of the decision making. Anyone want to jump in or say anything else about that? Okay. Let's talk about asks. So what I see with organizations is either they don't have any communication except asks, because they're prioritizing that because they know they need to get that so they can get money, or they have lots of communication and no asks because they feel awkward about it. So what I really want to say is like, they're essential and they may be part of what I like to call a balanced diet. So we don't want them every communication. We don't want them in no communications. You could shoot for maybe 25% of communications might be a good number to go with. Be brave. We've just talked about testing, right? So you can see what is it like. You could maybe take your database, divide them into 2 groups. What happens with one group if you ask them more and one group and you ask them less? What if you ask them in different ways? Doing a lot of testing over 4 years at one organization, by the 4th year, I mean that the year end, I was making tens of thousands of dollars more than we had in the beginning. I knew what worked. I knew what didn't work. I could drop anything that didn't work. And so, one thing again that can help us from being fearful is to use that testing and to let asking be, part of that. There are great times to ask. So year end is a really great time. Coming up to the 1 year since that person last made a gift is a good time to ask. When you have a need is a good time to ask. And right now, like I would say, we're in the pandemic. Most of us have needs. You don't need to stop asking right now. If you have needs, you should be asking. I've known good organizations who have some strong needs that we're scared to ask right now because of everything going on. It's like, well, your donors don't want you to shut down just because you were trying to be polite. They're going to maybe be very angry about that you let that happen because they care about what you're accomplishing in the world. Does anyone have anything else they want to share about asks, their experiences, positive or negative? Okay. All right. So we are done. I know we've stopped all the way through kind of for questions or comments, but this is a good time too for people to jump in with anything else that they want to ask.
Elizabeth, this is Ellen. I have a question about ask.
Mm-hmm.
So part of my interest in this webinar and this discussion is because I'm thinking about starting up a new nonprofit, which is something I've been highly discouraged from doing. But that discouragement has not come from individuals. It's come from, larger foundations that are trying to juggle lots and lots of competitive grant proposals. And truthfully, I think that this organization might be the pitch might be better for individuals who feel personally affected by this issue, as opposed to foundations that are dealing with more entrenched players. Has anybody that this group knows of tried an approach where you do one fundraising blitz for an endowment and you let people know that you are going to form an endowment and that endowment is going to sustain your organization for a 5-year period, and here are the goals for that 5-year period, so that you basically try to just get one chunk of money that gets invested and then spins off enough to keep your organization afloat for 5 years.
That's really interesting. Let me ask another question. What happens at the end of the 5 years?
Well, I think that would remain an open question for at least 3 years. I think at a 3-year point, you would say, what's the likelihood that we achieve some or all of our goals? Do we see avenues for setting new goals? Do we want to do another round of fundraising in year 4 to add to the endowment, or just to do more of a traditional ask? So I would say at year 3, there'd be an evaluation of what the next steps might look like.
So that's really interesting. I would say yes and no. One thing I would think about with an endowment is when you have an endowment, you have a huge chunk of money that's kind of tied up. And usually then you're only using a small percentage of that money to fund you.
Right.
And so then what happens sometimes then is those resources aren't really being applied to helping your organization or helping any other organization. It may mean that I'm not sure if you may mean perhaps fundraising a big chunk and then just kind of living off of that, allowing the endowment to go down over that course of 5 years. And then is that closer to maybe what you mean, that it's not like a chunk of money that never gets spent down?
Yeah, so it would be sort of a hybrid, right? And I guess maybe the more appropriate way to say it is that you ask somebody to make a commitment over a 5-year period of time, and they make that investment all up front. And so you, in addition to, you do intend to spend that entire amount over 5 years, but maybe some portion of it is able to earn interest in investments to contribute even more. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. All right. So it sounds like what you're looking at is a major gift funding model, and there are definitely organizations that are successful with that.
Okay.
The organizations that I see that do that successfully have networks of people with wealth. So the
Mhm.
people I've seen who've built those themselves have either had a trust fund, have come out of a Ivy League university, have networks with people who have wealth. And if that is the case, then I've seen those be very successful.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anyone else have questions? That was a really interesting one. Okay. Well, I want to thank all of you for being on today and for being participatory on the chat and with the questions. I really appreciate it. Here is my contact information. The website is on here, the nonprofitcoach.guru, and this is a good place to get past recordings of webinars like this. We've got topics on board and grant writing. We've got some really great upcoming topics around the legal ramifications in reopening some of our offices and what that is like for our employees. I believe we're going to be having some anti-racism conversations. So we've got some good things coming up, and I really thank all of you for being part of today's discussion.